Okay, hi, I'm Doug Smith, and we're here today with Fred Zilian. Actually, it's Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States. Fred's going to do a performance tonight. We're all looking forward to it very much. Fred, I'd like to ask you a couple questions about how you got interested in the Civil War specifically.
Well, about 17 years ago, I read a then current biography on Lincoln called Lincoln by David Herbert Donnell, professor up at Harvard. And it really, I really developed a fascination. So I enjoy writing. I had never written a play. I decided to write a one-man show. I was inspired by James Whitmore's one-man shows, 70s, 80s. He did Give 'Em Hell, Harry.
Yeah, okay,
Harry
sure.
Truman,
Harry Truman.
And he did Bully, Teddy Roosevelt. So that was my model. And then for the next 7 or 8 years, I performed it at the Abbey for the U.S. History course.
Yeah.
So I cleaned it up and cut it down and sharpened it up.
That's great.
And then when the Abraham Lincoln bicentennial came around, that was 2009.
2009, was it?
200 years since his birth. That's when I took it on the road. I appeared at the Capitol to kick off the Rhode Island bicentennial of Lincoln. And then the Redwood Library, the library in Jamestown. And then when your granddaughter's teacher calls, you have to say yes.
Absolutely. Can my grandfather come down and
yes,
do his thing? Well, that's great. You know, the interesting thing about the way you do this is you get so involved in his character. I mean,
yes.
When you come out of that door, you will be Abraham Lincoln.
Yes, well, I've been trying to be Abe for the last few hours, to get into his mindset, to get into his walk. That's one thing I enjoyed about the movie.
Yeah.
To see a pro Daniel Day-Lewis take on Lincoln.
Yeah.
I was interested in two things in particular. His walk, because we want him to be tall and beautiful and bold. John Wayne, Pericles, Cary Grant, but he wasn't. As Doris Kearns Goodwin tells us, he walked like a laborer. So I envision somebody that's worked in a coal mine for 10 or 12 hours and he's going home. That's how we walk.
Yeah.
The second thing is his voice. The sources say he had a high-pitched voice. Now, I decided long ago never to try to replicate that. But Daniel Day-Lewis, if you remember the film, he did succeed in raising his voice a few notches.
You recommend the film then?
Oh, yes, very much.
I haven't seen it yet, I have to admit.
Oh, yes, very much.
Okay. Yeah, we wondered because how somebody could give a speech to, you know, several hundred people. I'm not sure how many people were at the Gettysburg Address, but
10 to 20,000.
So how does somebody do that with no amplification? I mean, it's got to be difficult, I would think.
Well, I don't know how he did it. I'm sure he didn't reach the back 2,000. However, they crowded in, I guess. Plus, remember now, he had been giving speeches for a long time.
Sure.
He had a long political career, so he was used to it.
Yeah.
That's the way it was. You had to project, or else the people wouldn't hear you, and you wouldn't get their votes.
Yeah. I don't know, I've always kind of looked on Lincoln as a kind of a tragic figure because he had all the weight of this whole Civil War on his shoulders, and he took the presidency at a very contentious time in the United States. Mm-hmm. And yet he got through it all very well. And unfortunately, he was assassinated a week after the war ended, essentially, with the victory at Appomattox. But I look forward very much to your performance tonight.
Well, Doug, thank you for inviting me, and I'm happy to do my little part of civic duty from my town of Portsmouth.
Yeah, well, this is our 375th, and it happens to be today is the 150th anniversary of the actual speech itself. So I look forward to it very much.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Doug Smith, and I have the pleasure of introducing our performer tonight. Many people probably know Fred Zilian from, he's been teaching at local schools here. He's got quite an interesting background. And I want to explain how he got into this serious study of Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War. He retired from the Army in 1991, and he has been an educator at the Naval War College, Rhode Island College, Salve Regina University, and for 22 years at the Portsmouth Abbey School. He has a PhD in International Relations from the Johns Hopkins University and has authored numerous articles, essays, and book reviews on Germany, Europe, international affairs, religion, music, education, and of course the Civil War and Abraham Lincoln. He writes a monthly column on the Civil War for the Newport Daily News. In fact, this evening, his article on the Gettysburg Address is in the Newport Daily News in the editorial section. He and his wife, Jerry, live in Portsmouth. And his fascination with Abraham Lincoln began after reading David Herbert Donald's biography of Lincoln in 1997. He wrote a one-man play, Honest Abe, and for 10 years performed it for the students at Portsmouth Abbey School. I think back to when I was in school, and what a great thing for somebody to do, for kids, I think. In 2007, he took the play on the road, first performing it at the Redwood Library down in Newport. And since then, he's performed at libraries, schools, group meetings, and over dinner at the White Horse Tavern in Newport. He's also appeared at the Rhode Island State Capitol to kick off the state's celebration of the Lincoln Bicentennial in 2009. The Gettysburg Address that we'll hear tonight is probably one of the best-known speeches, and many consider it the best speech ever made in American history. It was delivered by Lincoln during the American Civil War on the afternoon of Thursday, November 19th, 1863, 150 years ago today, at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. This was 4.5 months after the Union armies defeated those of the Confederacy at the Battle of Gettysburg. But the war continued until General Lee's surrender to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, 1865. So it was just about in the middle of the Civil War. A week later, President Lincoln himself lay dead, the victim of an assassin's bullet. Lincoln's carefully crafted address at Gettysburg, secondary to the other speeches, he was not the featured speaker at this Gettysburg Memorial, came to be regarded as one of the greatest speeches in American history, and I think you'll agree after you hear it. In just over 2 minutes, Lincoln reiterated the principles of human equality espoused by the Declaration of Independence, proclaimed the Civil War as a struggle for the preservation of the Union sundered by the secession crisis, with a new birth of freedom that would bring true equality to all of its citizens. Lincoln also redefined the Civil War as a struggle not just for the Union, but for the principle of human equality. With this as background, ladies and gentlemen, please join me this evening in welcoming to these chambers the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln.
Hi, we got a small crowd. A small crowd, but a good crowd. Wow, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Well, tonight, I'd like to do several things. I'd like to look at some of the big issues that the Civil War presented to us, and then give you a little overview of the Civil War, and then talk about the first couple of years of the war leading up to Gettysburg, the Battle of Gettysburg, in July of '63, and then my address came several months after. I didn't realize it would become so famous. My goodness, I didn't realize that. You may know Mr. Edward Everett he really gave the Gettysburg Address. He spoke for 2 hours with no notes. He gave what was called the oration at Gettysburg. And then I'll give the address, and then any questions and answers, we can deal with that. Now, the Civil War really confronted our country with, I would say, 3 or 4 major questions. The first question was, were we mainly a federation with sovereign power in the federal government, power in the states, power in Portsmouth Town Council? So divided powers, but with the federal government being the supreme. Or were we more a confederation with states being the more powerful elements? That was the first question. The second question was, how could we pretend to be sometimes the sole beacons of freedom? Listen to those beautiful words which Thomas Jefferson wrote, his second paragraph. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Sorry, ladies. How could we square that with the existence of slavery? As I recall, we had about 31 million people in our country at that time, about 4 million of which were slaves. How did that square? The third big issue was, in a time of crisis, in this case the Civil War, what civil liberties could be abridged, how much they could be abridged or restricted, and who should restrict them. And then there's a fourth one, which maybe some people don't realize, but it's something I always spoke of, and I want to make sure you leave the halls tonight with this clearly in mind. It's too bad we don't have more young people here. Don't take our system of government for granted. The fourth issue was, is self-government an absurdity? Is it a farce? Should we be like those European states across the big ocean, led by a person with a name, a monarch? Was self-government just a whimsical, fanciful idea, or was it actually working? Now, you folks are still here. I understand we still are a republic and a democracy. So I guess for 240 years, I guess we beat ancient Athens then, yeah. We're longer in existence than good old ancient Athens then, huh? Good. All right, well, overview of the war. I don't know how much you know about it. I think Mr. Smith gave a nice introduction. Fort Sumter, April 12th, 1861, the so-called Confederate States fired on a federal fort in Charleston Bay. And then the fighting wasn't totally over, but it was essentially over when Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant, April 12th, April 9th, rather, 1865. The sporadic fighting did continue on for a few months or two, but the war was essentially over. Now, initially it was about this question of confederation or federation. Did states have the right, did a state or states have the right to leave the Union without the permission of the others? And this goes back to one's concept of our formation, our Declaration of Independence, and our Constitution. Of course, the southern states said we were first and foremost a collection of states. I never believed that. I believed, as President of the United States, I derived my power not from some states or all the states. I derived it from the people. How does our Constitution begin, you may remember? Does it begin, we the people, or does it begin, we the states? We the collected states of America? No, no, no. It begins, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union. So, it began like that, but then I sensed, a year or two into the war, I'll talk more about this later, that we were ready to take it to a higher plane. And that is, it was no longer about keeping the Union together, it was also about the idea of equality and the idea of freedom. I thought the country was ready then to redefine ourselves, as I say in my address, for a rebirth of freedom. So we took it to a higher plane with some resistance. But I'll speak about my Emancipation Proclamation about halfway through the war. The average Civil War soldier, I understand, was about 25 years old. He was about 5'8". Who's 5'8"? Is anyone 5'8" in here? About 5'8", and weighed 143 pounds. Pretty lean, huh? Yeah. About 2.2 million men fought for the Union. And of course, figures on the so-called Confederate States are really hazy, but let's say 1.4, 1.5 million people, soldiers fought for the Confederacy. And I don't know what the latest figures are for the deaths. Most conventional figures have been about 600,000, 620,000, but I understand in recent times here, some historians are even pushing it higher to 700,000. So a lot of soldiers. Now, only 1 in 65 died in combat. 1 in 13, you may know, we lost more soldiers to disease. This is both sides now. 1 in 13 died of disease, and about 1 in 10 were wounded. Okay. So a little overview of the war. All right. let's then move to the beginning of the war. As I said, April of 1861, the so-called Confederate States, I never really recognized them. That's why I don't say the Confederate States of America. I never recognized them as an entity. I always considered this as a rebellion of people who lived in states in the South. And you may recall, initially there were 7. Do you recall the first state to leave? I'll give you a hint, Fort Sumter, South Carolina. And by the time of my inauguration in March, I think it was 7, but then the other 4 states left. So we had a total of 11 states that left the Union to form the so-called Confederate States, the so-called Confederate States of America. Now that first year of the war, let me give you some highlights. Well, they were up to 11 states. We, I guess, were 18 or 19. There were actually a state or 2 that was formed during those 4 years, during the war, including West Virginia, for example, became a state. Oh, the first battle. We thought it'd be a picnic bull run. I mean, some people got on their carriages, picnic baskets. Let's go out and have some entertainment. Of course, the Union will win. Well, we did not win. We did not win at all. It was really bad. General McDowell just simply was not up to it. So there was Bull Run. There was also, you may remember General Winfield Scott, a pretty old feller. He was aging, pretty overweight. He was ailing. But anyway, his strategy in the initial phases of the war was to try to squeeze the South. Some people called it the Anaconda Plan. Squeeze the South. So we deployed the Navy in a blockade, eventually Admiral Farragut, doing good things down in the South. And we eventually, throughout the war, tried to win control of that whole waterway, the Great Mississippi. So there was the blockade. Lastly, let's say April, getting now into the war, April 61 to April 62, we have that really big battle, which really changed my thinking and the thinking of many people of the war. It was actually, in the North, it was named after the church, ironically called, the name of the church actually in Hebrew means place of peace. Very good, Shiloh. So, of course, we had casualties, hundreds, maybe a few thousand in previous battles. But now at the Battle of Shiloh, there were something like 3,500 fatalities and 24,000 casualties. So including killed, wounded, missing in action, and confused, dazed, out of commission. Ladies and gentlemen, after Shiloh, which was the beginning of April, we'd been at it for about a year. We'd been trying to bring the Union back into it. We kind of looked at each other and we said, this is going to be a damn bloody affair. And so it was. As you know, the war continued for another 3 years. So that was the first year of the war. Let's see, what were the highlights from the second year? Well, oh, McClellan. Yeah, George. West Pointer, huh? Got to watch those West Pointers. George McClellan was really fantastic at training, recruiting, training, equipping, all the logistics of armies, but once it came to fight, he just couldn't do it. So he had this scheme, you must have read about it, the Peninsular Campaign, and his objective continued to be the capital of the South, Richmond, when I tried to gently encourage him to make it the armies of the South, especially General Robert E. Lee's army, the Army of Northern Virginia. But he said, no, 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 the capital, the capital. So I believe he got within 6 miles of the capital. And then, ladies and gentlemen, let's face it, General McClellan had the slows. He just really could not, he didn't know how to fight a big army. So that was one episode. Now we had this man, General Grant. The first year of the war, General Grant was bringing his victories in the West, like not tremendous victories, but Fort Henry, Fort Donelson. The second year, he was also bringing us victories, and that was great. Now, you may have heard people were trying to get me to fire him. I said, why am I going to fire him? He's bringing us victories. And so you know what they told me. They said, Mr. President, General Grant is a drunk. I said, you know how I responded? I said, if he is drinking too much liquor, I want to know what type of liquor he is drinking. I want to give it to the other generals. So that generally quieted them. General Grant, I really liked him. I mean, he fought, you know. He knew how to fight this war. Terrible war. Anyway, and then we had Admiral Farragut. I think we're near the esteemed Naval War College, aren't we, here in Newport? So Admiral Farragut, yes, he was bringing us winds. I think by the time of April, where are we now? Second year of the war, April of '63, yeah, he had brought us Memphis. Oh, and of course New Orleans, yeah. So we were working our way, gaining control of that great waterway, the Mississippi. And I reckon we needed to take Vicksburg, and eventually Grant would go after Vicksburg. But anyway, that's kind of the spring, summer of 62, and then it brings us to the summer and the fall of 62. And these were important times because I could sense that the sentiment, public feeling against slavery was growing. The feeling that we didn't have that first year, you know, when people were pushing me, you know, about the abolitionists from the very beginning, plus our radical Republican friends like Thaddeus Stevens. He was pushing me and pushing me. Slavery, slavery. I said, sir, we need Kentucky. If I lose Kentucky, we'll probably lose Missouri. These were, now do you remember it? All of the 18 Union states were not slave-free. I hope everybody remembers that. Sometimes that's lost. People think that, well, the slave states were down there and the Union states were free states. Not true. There were 4 border states: Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, and Maryland. And that first year, we needed to keep them in the Union. I thought if we lost Kentucky, Missouri, the game might be up. The bottom would be out of the tub. So I wanted to announce an emancipation of the slaves in rebel-held territory. Not because I thought it was morally objectionable. I thought it was moral. I always thought slavery was morally objectionable. As a young boy, I can remember living in Indiana. This is after we moved from Kentucky. And I can hear the clank still. I can hear the clank as the slaves walked by our house, our little log cabin there. And that remained in my mind. And then you may recall when I was 19, 20, I was hired to take a freight down the Great Mississippi down to New Orleans, and there I saw my first slave market. And that made an indelible impression on my mind. No, I've always been anti-slavery. However, I did not feel, even though it sounds paradoxical, that I had the right to free the slaves in states that remained within the Union. After all, they were considered property. I didn't feel I had the authority. Now, I did have the authority, I suppose, I always thought, in the middle of a war, indeed a civil war. I had the power to do just about anything, so to speak, to get the job done, to keep the Union together. So I issued the Emancipation Proclamation based on my authority as Commander-in-Chief. We wanted to take those resources away from the enemy, the rebels. Now, in my heart, of course, I wish I could free every slave. I didn't even know whether it was legal. Whether it was legal or not, I don't know. I didn't know. So the Emancipation Proclamation, we issued the preliminary, so-called preliminary Emancipation Proclamation September 22nd of '62, and then the final proclamation, I didn't plan it this way. It was 100 days later. January 1st, 1863, it went into effect. And there was no doubt in my mind. You may have heard the stories that my hand shook as I signed the final proclamation. Do you know why my hand was shaking? Because I had just, for 3 hours, I had been on a receiving line for New Year's Day. I had been shaking hands for over 2 hours. But there was no doubt in my mind, there was no hesitation. I signed it, and to this day, I'm still happy I signed it. It was another step forward in the march of freedom. The Emancipation Proclamation. Now, I believe, well, here I am in Rhode Island, am I not? So continuing on in the war, you may recall December, your very own Ambrose Burnside, right? He was now the commander of the Army of the Potomac. A good man, a decent man, a man of integrity, but very bad, lost very badly at Fredericksburg. And that was December, as I recall, December of '62. Ladies and gentlemen, it was a very bad time, December of '62. I can recall I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. I thought maybe even divine providence was against us. You know, that reminds me of a story. When I was a young man, you may recall, I was once boarded with a Protestant minister, you know, and I was asleep one night, and it's a cold winter's night, as I recall, and suddenly, rap, rap, rap on the door. Abraham, awake! The day of judgment is at hand. So it was the deacon, you know, and I rushed to the window. Well, there were shooting stars coming down. But then I looked for those good old constellations in the background, the ones we all know and love, and they were still there. I said, no, deacon, no, the world's not coming to an end yet. So that's what I had to remember in December of '62. January, February, winter, yes, trying months. You may recall the Peace Democrats. Do you recall the nickname we had? The common nickname for the Peace Democrats that wanted peace, peace, peace at any price? We called them Copperheads. So especially Vallandigham from Ohio. And in fact, I think it was General Burnside. We had to take him out of that position after that failure, but we still gave him the command out in Ohio, as I recall. Yeah, it must have been Ohio, because that's where Vallandigham was from. Well, he arrested him, you know, on treason. So that was a difficult situation, Well, let's then, now we're up to 1863, then let's talk about the big battle, Gettysburg. So I think Mr. Smith talked a little about Gettysburg, a fairly unremarkable town of maybe 2,500 people. Who would have known kind of a sleepy town in Pennsylvania would go down in the history books? This battle was fought July 1st to July 3rd, and Rhode Island, I think Rhode Island mustered actually 6 units, well, 5 artillery batteries from the 1st Light Artillery Regiment. And then, as I recall, it was the 2nd Volunteer Infantry Regiment, led by, who was the colonel? I want to say Horatio Rogers, Colonel Horatio Rogers, I want to say. A lawyer, good man. He was a lawyer. I know lawyers. Yeah. Good people, those lawyers. So, and as I recall, not all the units took part in the struggle. I think, well, thank goodness for the artillery batteries. In fact, many of the commanders, many of the generals really they wanted batteries from Rhode Island. You did something right to your artillerymen here. Yeah. And I think there were 3 batteries that took part in the actual fighting, heavy fighting, and I think the 2nd Volunteer Regiment took part in day number 3. Well, it was a tough battle. Figures, let's round it off, 90,000 Union forces. And you remember the general. He had only been in command for 3 days. George Gordon Meade. 3 days, that was it. He had been in charge of the Army of the Potomac. And against him, of course, was none other than General Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee still, of course, had not been beaten, not really. So there was this air of invincibility. And of course, our Southern friends, the rebels, they kind of had a chip on their shoulders. Yeah, because they had so many victories. We had no really decisive victories. Antietam, you recall, that's why I pushed forward with the Emancipation Proclamation. Antietam was a win, but not a very decisive win. So 3 days in July, Gettysburg, and Rhode Island was there. Thank you, Rhode Island. Small but tough, huh? And on the third day, you may have heard about Pickett's charge. Oh, some 14,000 Confederates came, and the main attack was as I understand, was in the middle of our lines. I'm surprised General Lee, actually his plan in hindsight was not a good one. Wait a minute, I believe General Gouverneur Warren hailed from Rhode Island. Maybe I'm mistaken. But he is the one who saw that Little Round Top, that little hill, had to be secured, that if the Confederates were to win that hill, they could fire right down, enfilade into the lines of the Union forces. Oh, thank goodness. And then you've probably heard about Joshua Chamberlain and the main regiment that stood its ground. Yes, Colonel Chamberlain, great man. So the Union happily prevailed, and several implications. Robert E. Lee's crown of invincibility was now no more, was crushed. Secondly, we had them skedaddle out of there. I was disappointed that Meade really didn't follow up and pursue them well, but then again, try to understand, you know. What we had really, the Army had the war right in the hollow of its hand, did not close it. So we had decisively beaten the South, and they knew it. I understand, maybe 28,000 casualties on the South, 23,000 for the North, but still, we definitely beat them. Now, it ended July 3rd, essentially, except for the pursuit. Who remembers July 4th, the good news we got? On July 4th, the very next day, who's our man who was called the drunk? Grant. General Grant tells us that the siege of Vicksburg, that key city on the Mississippi, has finally been reduced, has finally succeeded, I should say. Vicksburg surrenders. Ladies and gentlemen, that was a glorious 4th of July. Now, there were plenty of other Confederate victories, lots of tough fighting. Oh my goodness, Cold Harbor, the Wilderness Campaign. Oof. But that, of course, comes in the future. The war, as you know, would continue for another 2 years. So that's kind of the context. Let's talk about the address now. Mr. Smith talked a little about the address. As I told you, the person that really gave the address, although it wasn't called an address then, it was called an oration, was Edward Everett, and he had a long resume, governor of Massachusetts, and minister to England, House of Representatives, senator. So he was one of the most popular orators of the time. Do we still have orators like that, I wonder? He spoke for 2 hours. And my speech was very simple. I was not asked to give the oration. I was asked to give, quote, a few appropriate remarks. So, I understand there's some story that I wrote the address on the back of a scrap of paper on my way, on the train ride. No. I never wrote speeches like that. I wanted my appropriate remarks to be brief, but also powerful. And you understand the context. So I wanted to certainly honor the fallen, and you do notice that I didn't say Union soldiers. The address does not say Union fallen. It says the fallen. So I wanted to honor the valor and courage, the dedication, the commitment, the last full measure of devotion that all soldiers gave there. And I also saw it was an occasion to remind people of how our war aims, the nature of the war, had changed. We're now November, so now we're 2.5 years into the war. As I recall, there was applause 4 or 5 times. Don't remember quite exactly. I spoke after Edward Everett, and I don't know, I would estimate 13, 14, maybe 15,000 people there. November 19th, 1863. I thought it'd be a good occasion, yes, once again, to underscore those beautiful words that Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. So, and then after honoring the dead, I wanted to identify, as I said, the great task remaining before us. Certainly, we had to win the war. No, I was thinking of higher things than that. And if you look at the words carefully, I use the words what? A new birth of freedom. A new birth of freedom. So we had to expand this definition of freedom, which began way back 100 years before, 77 years before, when we broke from Great Britain over rights and freedoms. So we had to reanoint ourselves and redefine our concept of freedom. I wanted to underline that. And the second thing, as I mentioned, that I wanted to underline was that, oh my goodness, I don't know when I said this. Maybe I said it more than one time. This is before the Gettysburg Address. At one point, maybe 2 months into the war, I underlined the importance. I said the central idea pervading this struggle is the necessity to prove that popular government is not an absurdity. So those are the two things really coupled together, which to me were the great remaining task. Of course, we had to win the war. If we didn't win the war, we'd all be in trouble. So, ladies and gentlemen, should I then now read the address? Okay. And I'll be happy to take questions afterward. Oh, by the way, I did read the address. Okay. I don't know if I had 1 or 2 sheets. Yeah, so old here. I had to get special glasses after I came out of the grave. Yes. Yeah. I never did find out what liquor General Grant liked. No, I guess we never talked about that. "Fourscore-and-7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation, so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggle here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or to detract. The world will little nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Thank you, thank you, thank you. The words still resonate. I still enjoy the words. Well, now you can ask questions not only about what I've talked about. I didn't talk about my early life. I didn't talk about the presidency, really. So feel free to ask any questions.
Knowing that Lincoln had a lot of critics during the war and close to the time of his death, what did the critics say immediately after the address? Like, was there any sort of critique, immediate reaction?
Well, you may expect my answer, and that is it depended on the newspaper that you read. Back then, I don't know about today, but we had newspapers, many newspapers, that were either Republicans, supported the Republicans, this new party that we had formed, the Whigs, the Republicans, or supported the Democrats. So I don't know if you had a lot of really independent voices. So it would really depend. Now I'm speaking of the North. If you go down south, I'm sure they simply dismissed it as poppycock. Yes. Questions? Yes.
I was born in a border state,
You are.
in Washington County, which of course is just south of Gettysburg and the state line, but it also contains the site of Antietam. And those were two ghastly battles. Do you think they were, I mean, I don't think American military has ever suffered more casualties in a single day than Antietam.
Antietam. Shiloh, Antietam, Gettysburg. Well, actually, Chickamauga was actually between the Battle of Gettysburg and my address. So it was, as I recall, early September. That was actually the second worst casualties behind Gettysburg. So Antietam, I think, came after Chickamauga. Now, I didn't speak much about Antietam, but you may know, Antietam, though, was enough of a victory for us that I felt we could go ahead. That was the last thing we needed in order to announce the preliminary emancipation. You may recall that I had a very important cabinet meeting in July of '62. That's when I wanted to announce the Emancipation Proclamation. Volunteers were dwindling. Great Britain and France were poised to recognize the Confederacy. Politically, that would have been disastrous. The Congress had just passed the Second Confiscation Act, demanding the freedom of the slaves. I felt I was the only one that could free the slaves by my war power authority, not the Congress. Governors were coming to me and saying, I don't know if I can really give you our requisition, our state requisition. The volunteers are dwindling. And so I had the cabinet meeting, and there were supporters, and there were several that did not think it was a good idea to announce the proclamation. Secretary of State Seward, William Seward, he's the one that convinced me. He said, Mr. President, if you do it now, what were his words? It's going to appear it's the last gasp of a desperate government. You need to wait for a military victory. So yes, sir, the price of Antietam was very high, but politically it allowed me, I think it was just 5 days afterward I announced the proclamation. I thought it was enough of a victory. And now that you know, Great Britain and France, because it could have gone either way, especially Great Britain. I think France was watching Great Britain. If Great Britain recognized the Confederacy, then France would have, and then it would have been a different contest. Yes. So,
with the huge loss of life, well, up to Gettysburg, I'd say, huge loss of life.
unprecedented.
Yeah. Now, how's a farmer up in Vermont feel about sending his son off to fight a war like this?
Yes, indeed. I'm sure if you have a son, you know, I had 4 sons. Difficult to think about. You know, we lost Eddie and we lost Willie when I was in the White House. But probably not much different than you would feel if when you sent off your son to the war. Now, you know, I'm pretty sure you know that Mary, well, I called her Molly, my wife, we had differences over Robert. Robert Todd was our first son. I can't recall how old he was, but he wanted to go to war, and after losing not 1, but 2 sons to disease, to sickness. I don't know what Eddie had, but I'm pretty sure it was typhoid. Willie was 11 or 12. Molly was never she probably wasn't the same after losing Eddie, but we were in the White House and we lost Willie, and she definitely was never the same after that. So it was difficult, but my son wanted to, so you may know that we got him on General Grant's staff. I didn't want him to be shot, to come home dead. Mrs. Lincoln would definitely have gone off the edge. Yes?
How old were you at the time of the Gettysburg Address?
Well, let's see, I was born in '09. The address was '63, so what is that, 54 years old? February, I guess, was it 50, yeah. Yeah.
Would you share some thoughts about Andersonville, the Confederate prison camp?
Yeah, I did receive reports on that. Terrible, terrible. And you know, we tried to do our best to keep our prisons where the rebels were, at least give them the basics. After all, we are humans. So we began to think about what I think you call today just war theory. If you believe, well, actually, I think of good old General William Tecumseh Sherman. I understand there's a famous quote of his out these days. War is hell. It'll always be hell. Don't try to sugarcoat it, he said, words to that effect. If you believe that you surrender your humanity, if you're a religious man, you surrender your religion as soon as the first gun goes off, then I think you can perpetrate heinous crimes which you're going to feel quite badly about after the war, whether you win or you lose. If you're a Quaker, I love these Quakers. Sometimes I wish I was one. They always believed that violence was not the answer. That's another answer. But if you're somewhere in the middle, if you believe that you can, even in war, retain your humanity and your sense of ethics, well then we have to try to avoid things like the terrible conditions in Andersonville. Yes. Well, I hope the commander was prosecuted. Other questions? Yeah.
Was it General Meade that you were annoyed at that didn't follow?
Yes, yes, after Gettysburg.
Right.
Well, I enjoyed being president, and I knew, yes. You know, it took us several years to find the right men. I've mentioned 2 of them, Grant several times, and then William Tecumseh Sherman, like General Sheridan. It took us a few years, but that's why I say Gettysburg, that period, the summer of '63 was so important. Gettysburg, Vicksburg. I'm very sorry it took still 2 years, but it just showed you how tough those rebels were and how skillful General Lee was, yes. I tried to give him a command, you know, at the beginning of the war, but he said his loyalty was first to Virginia.
In light of your Gettysburg Address, what were your thoughts on the
Okay, let's make sure my understanding of the Indian question is yours. So, explain what you mean by the Indian question. Just our overall treatment of European settlers, of whites, how we treated the Indians, and how we...
Well, maybe the context of the question is did you have any guilt in including or excluding Indians
in the Civil War? Yeah, you got to read Professor Zilian's essay on that. He was telling me that one day he woke up about 6 months ago and said, what happened to the Indians in the Civil War? Did they just go smoke a pipe? What happened? So, but I mean, your question is a good question. This is something, I think it's a very sad chapter in the history of Americans of European descent, how we treated Native Americans. And you know, of course, I think the enemies of the United States are quick to point out that the hypocrisy that we showed, first with blacks, and then also, though, with, well, we call them Indians. Now you call them Native Americans. So, oh my goodness, you may have remembered that the Trail of Tears, as I recall, that was during Andrew Old Hickory's administration. He was president from 1828 to 1836, was it? And that's when we removed Seminoles from Florida to, back then it was called the Oklahoma, I think we called it the Oklahoma Territory. It wasn't a state yet, it wasn't organized. And also, I remember my reading 15,000 maybe, Indians from northwest Georgia, Cherokees. And the Cherokees, they had really become quite, you could say, European, quite white. I mean, I remember seeing an Indian newspaper, or at least hearing that they had their own newspaper. They had a constitution. But there were just so many whites, huh? And they wanted the land. And the Indians had prime land. If we had to do it again, I wonder if we could have done it some other way.
A more personal level.
Yes.
Did you have any close friends that you could hang out with and talk about these big issues?
Well, you know, William Seward and I got to be, I would say, very close. I was very close to Molly, my wife. And then, of course, there was Bill Herndon. Before I became president, my law partner in Springfield. He was always there. There was Josh Speed. I understand there's some books out saying I'm homosexual. Is that what you call it? Because I slept with Josh Speed. Well, of course, back then, that was very common. We didn't have these wonderful hotels where you had not one, but 2 beds. Why do you need 2 beds in a room? Why do you need, you sleep in one. Do you get up in the middle of the night and move to the other? So back then in boarding houses, it was very common to sleep with another man. Yeah, hopefully he didn't have any lice or any bugs. Who else? Well, my children. You know, I love my children. They were fun. And when we were in the White House, we had 2. Robert was off, actually he was up here. He was up, what's it called? Phillips Exeter Academy. That's where he was in school, and then Harvard. So we had, well, his name was William Wallace. We called him Willie. And then we had Thomas. We called him Tad. And they kept us going. I'd be here in a cabinet meeting. So picture you in these chambers here, and suddenly the president is Mr. 70, is it? Picture Mr. 70's child come riding in on a pony, you know, and take Mr. 70 as a prisoner and carry him out. Yes. I probably let my sons do a little too much, but, well, I loved them a lot. We had a lot of fun. Other questions?
Were you actually a rail splitter back then?
Oh, yes. I did split some rails. Yeah, I had calluses. I was certainly a common man, you know, the one-room cabin, that was true. In Kentucky, yes, for fencing. And when I was trying to get elected, of course, someone latched onto that, and yeah, it was a big hit. That was my nickname there for a while, the Rail Splitter. Of course, I had many other nicknames. I'm very proud of the nickname Honest Abe, of course. But I understand my assistants, John Hay and John Nicolay, they called me behind my back the Old Tycoon. Oh, there must have been a few other nicknames. The Old Honest Abe, yeah. But Honest Abe, I'm really quite proud of. So, well, I want to thank you. Oh, one more.
Did Professor Zilian have any opportunity to talk with Frank Williams, who's the expert on the life of Abraham Lincoln?
Yeah, I understand Fred Zilian and Frank Williams are close friends. Frank Williams now is at the real Gettysburg. Fred Zilian decided not to go. Yeah, yeah, yes.
Does Zilian think of the most recent movie that covered a lot of the events?
Oh, he thought it was very good. Yeah, he was especially interested in how I walked, because I guess nowadays, since I've become such a celebrity and so popular, people expect me to be erect, and a combination of, who was he? John Wayne, Cary Grant, Sylvester Stallone. And that's not the way I was. I tried to clean, I tried to clean myself up, but normally they tell me my pants were too high. Yeah, my hair is a mess. But I tried to put on a clean shirt. So I was interested, Mr. Zilian said, yeah, he was interested in the walk and also my voice. Yeah. You know, a rather high-pitched voice it was. Very good. Well, as you know, it wasn't so much about the war. It was about the abolition of slavery, which happened after my death. I, of course, wonder just, you know, I would like to stick around for a while and really take the temperature of freedom in the United States now. What is our definition of freedom now? And minorities, someone asked a good question about Native Americans. Just how do we view freedom? What's the definition? Who's included and who's excluded? And if someone is, let's say, excluded or given lesser rights, is there a sound basis for that? I would close, though, again with repeating one more time, don't take self-government for granted. Self-government, popular government has to be tended, I like to say. Has to be tended. If the citizenry is not informed, is not educated, and is not active, then the citizenry cannot complain when they elect corrupt politicians that tax them too much, that takes their money and their property and infringes upon their rights. So please pass that gospel according to Abe Lincoln. Thank you very much.